Kelly Ghaisar arrived in America in 1979, fleeing a revolution, carrying a singular, unshakable belief that the police were the walls of a sanctuary designed to keep her children safe. To Kelly, the United States was not just a destination. It was a promise of a charmed life, a lovely bubble where her children, Bijan and Nagin, could grow up equal and free. She never saw the need to teach her son to fear a badge or a siren. She believed that in this adopted country, the values of justice and liberty were not just words on a page, but a physical shield that would follow him into adulthood. This is a story about the precise moment that shield shattered. It is a chronicle of a 10-minute encounter on a dark Virginia roadway that obliterated a family's reality and replaced it with a 7-year endurance in a legal wilderness. Why did 2 federal officers fire 10 shots into an unarmed man's head following a minor fender bender? How does a family survive when the very system they trusted becomes their primary antagonist? We are not just examining a shooting, but the total psychological destruction of the American dream. Picture a peaceful suburban neighborhood at dusk, the kind of place where the Ghaisars built their prosperous life. Then, contrast that with the grainy, high-contrast freeze frame of a Jeep Grand Cherokee, the vehicle that became Bijan's coffin. Kelly Ghaisar once lived in a world where the police were protectors. Now, she knows better. But for her son, that realization came far too late. The Ghaisar family lived in a bubble of safety that Kelly had spent 40 years constructing. She was a successful interior designer. Her husband, James, was an accountant. They had achieved everything the immigrant journey promises: a beautiful home, respected careers, and 2 children who were the center of their universe. Bijan was 25 years old, a young man with a huge heart who worked alongside his father at the accounting firm. Those who knew him described him as considerate, generous, and handsome. Crucially, Bijan possessed what his mother described as an almost pathological fear of guns. He was a young man who had never been in trouble, never even received a speeding ticket. He was the literal embodiment of the good kid the system is supposed to value. On the evening of November 17th, 2017, that equilibrium was breached. Bijan was driving his Jeep Grand Cherokee on the George Washington Memorial Parkway in Northern Virginia, just across the river from the nation's capital. It was a routine drive until a minor rear-end collision occurred. An Uber driver struck the back of Bijan's Jeep. For reasons that remain unknown to this day, Bijan did not stop at the scene. Perhaps it was a moment of confusion, or perhaps the initial seed of a panic that would soon grow to consume him. A passenger inside the Uber called 911 to report the incident, claiming that Bijan had fled. The 911 dispatcher put out a call identifying the Jeep. The response was not a local patrol, but a federal one: Lucas Vineyard and Alejandro Amaya, 2 officers with the U.S. Park Police, spotted the vehicle and initiated a pursuit as the blue lights flickered against the dark waters of the Potomac River. The bubble Kelly had built for 4 decades began to crack. To the officers, this was a pursuit of a fleeing suspect. To Bijan, a man terrified of firearms, the sight of federal agents closing in with weapons drawn was likely his worst nightmare realized. The contradiction between his gentle nature and the escalating federal response created a friction that was about to ignite. The pursuit was recorded by a Fairfax County police car that had joined the chase. This footage would later become the only objective witness to the chaos that followed. The first stop occurred on the shoulder of the parkway. Officers Vineyard and Amaya approached the Jeep with their guns raised and pointed directly into the car. For a young man like Bijan, who had no experience with the law and a deep-seated fear of violence, this was an existential crisis. He pulled away. A second stop followed shortly after. This time, Officer Amaya ran to the vehicle, gun drawn, and began banging the weapon against the window. Again, terrified, Bijan drove off. The final stop was the point of no return. The parked police cruiser pulled in front of the Jeep, forcing it to a halt. As the Jeep began to roll slowly forward at a walking pace, not a lunge, but a slow, mechanical roll, Amaya jumped from his car with his weapon unholstered. He did not wait. He did not seek cover. He fired repeatedly through the windshield. As the Jeep drifted toward a ditch, Vineyard joined him. Together, they continued to pump lead into the cabin. The tally was staggering. 10 shots fired at close range, all directed at the head of an unarmed man. The entire event, from the first lights to the final shot, lasted less than 10 minutes. While Bijan lay slumped in a car that is still slowly rolling into the mud, the officers began a different kind of maneuver. They began the construction of a narrative. They reholstered their weapons, the smoke still clearing from the windshield, while the system began to close ranks. There was no weapon in the Jeep. There was no drugs, no alcohol, no history of violence. There was only a 25-year-old accountant with 10 bullets in his skull. The silence that followed the gunfire was not an end, but the beginning of an abyss that would swallow the Ghaisar family for the next 7 years. Back in their beautiful home, Kelly and James Ghaisar were unaware that their lives had ended. Everything felt perfect until 1 a.m., when the knock came. 2 park police officers stood on the doorstep. From the very first sentence, the deception began. They told Kelly there had been a shootout, a word that implies a two-way exchange of fire. They spoke as if some gangster thing had occurred. Kelly knew instantly they were lying. Her son didn't own a gun. He wouldn't even be in the same room as one if he could help it. The officers gave the Ghaisars a business card and told them to call when they reached the hospital. They never answered that phone again. When the family arrived at the hospital, they found Bijan in a coma, hovering between life and death. But they were met with a blockade. The hospital staff, visibly uncomfortable, informed Kelly that they had received an email from the park police forbidding anyone from entering Bijan's room. The police had not told the parents what had happened to their child, but they had placed armed guards at his door. For 10 days, the Ghaisars lived in a waiting room, sleeping on air beds. They were allowed to see Bijan for only a few minutes every hour. They were forbidden from touching him. The police claimed his body was evidence, a crime scene that could not be contaminated by a mother's touch. The trauma of those 10 days was physical. Kelly watched as the bandages were removed, revealing a face that had been completely destroyed. The handsome, grinning young man from the family photos was gone. One of his ears had been shot off. His nose was severed. His eyes were swollen beyond recognition. To Kelly, the cruelty felt intentional. It wasn't just about the shooting. It was about the demonstration of power. The police wanted the family to be scared. They wanted them to know who held the authority. After 10 days of breathing through a machine, Kelly had to make the choice to let her son go. It was the hardest decision of her life, driven by a desire to remove what was left of Bijan from the grip of the people who had killed him. Bijan's death was not just a loss, it was an absolute catastrophe, an obliteration. In the wake of the funeral, the Ghaisars realized they were no longer just grieving parents. They were litigants against the most powerful government on earth. For 16 months, the park police refused to even identify the officers who fired the shots. They released no information. They offered no apologies. The only way the family could even learn the names of Vineyard and Amaya was by filing a wrongful death lawsuit in 2018. It was a civil tool used to pry open a federal door that had been slammed shut and locked from the inside. The legal battle became a masterclass in the fortress of immunity. When you fight the federal government and they close ranks, there is nowhere to go. The park police are federal. The FBI, which conducted the investigation, is federal. The courts are federal. For 2 years, the family waited for the Department of Justice to act, only to be told that no federal charges would be filed. A brief flare of hope appeared in 2020 when a local Fairfax County grand jury took the rare step of indicting Vineyard and Amaya for manslaughter. It felt like a turning point, a sign that the lovely bubble of justice might still exist. But that hope was short-lived. In October 2021, a federal judge stepped in and dismissed all criminal charges. The justification was qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that protects government workers from prosecution for actions taken on the job unless it can be proven they acted with malicious intent. The judge went further, describing the 2 men as fine police officers and declaring that firing 10 shots into the head of an unarmed man was necessary and proper. To the law, the bullets were a procedural necessity. To Kelly Ghaisar, those words were a second killing of her son. The system had not only taken his life, it had now validated his execution. The cost of this 7-year fight has been a survival tax paid in the currency of the soul. The Ghaisar home is no longer a place of movie nights and festive, identical pajama sets. Those traditions have been replaced by grim, focused activism. When the family gathers now, they don't watch films. They open their laptops and strategize. They analyze foundation goals and lobby against the very laws that shielded Bijan's killers. In January 2024, the family received another blow. Officers Vineyard and Amaya returned to active duty at the park police. After years of paid leave, they were back on the force, wearing the same badges they wore the night they destroyed a family. In 2023, the civil suit was settled for $5 million. To many, this might look like a victory, but to Kelly, it was disgusting. A financial settlement without an admission of guilt or a criminal conviction is just a price tag on a human life. It is the government's way of making a problem go away without having to fix the underlying rot. Kelly visits Bijan's grave every single day. She has channeled her grief into the Bijan Ghaisar Foundation, becoming an impassioned campaigner against qualified immunity. She is no longer the interior designer who believed in the American dream. That person died in a hospital waiting room in 2017. The woman who remains is forged from a different material. She has found a fire and a strength she never knew existed. A resilience born from a refusal to let her son's spirit be corroded by bitterness. She views her activism not as a choice, but as a biological necessity. She believes 100% that racism played a role in the shooting, that because Bijan was a Middle Eastern guy, the officers felt they could shoot first and ask questions later. She has seen that the system she thought was there to protect her was actually designed to protect its own. Justice is a word often used in the United States. But for the Ghaisars, it became a mountain they must climb every single day for the rest of their lives. Survival is rarely about physical strength. It is about the stubborn refusal to stop moving when the world has forgotten you exist. Kelly Ghaisar is still moving. Her mission is to ensure that no other family has to face a hospital blockade or watch a federal judge call the killing of their child necessary and proper. She knows that ending qualified immunity might not happen in her lifetime, but she refuses to stop for a single second. She is channeling Bijan's spirit, a force she describes as light and love, to fuel a fight against a machine that expects her to eventually go quiet. The final reflection on the American dream for the Ghaisars is one of profound loss, but also of an unexpected, hardened endurance. The Washington Monument looms in the background of many photos of Kelly standing on courthouse steps, a symbol of the very territory the park police serve. It stands as a reminder of the power she is up against. But Kelly stands taller. She is no longer naive, no longer living in a bubble. She is a survivor of an institutional obliteration, and she carries her son's memory as a shield. "I will not stop fighting for Bijan," she says, "not while I still live and breathe." The person she was is gone, but the person she has become is the only thing standing between the truth and the silence the federal government tried to impose. Bijan's handsome face, once grinning in photos, is now the face of a movement. His death was the end of a young life, but his mother has ensured it was not the end of his story. In the end, it is the survivor's mind that determines the legacy of a tragedy. Kelly has chosen to turn her negative energy into a foundation of change. She is a biological clock that refuses to stop ticking, a mother who has turned her grief into a fire that refuses to be extinguished. The American dream may have died for her on a dark Virginia parkway, but her fight for justice has created a new, more resilient reality. One where the walls of the sanctuary are built not by the police, but by the families who refuse to let their children be forgotten. The silence that follows a gunshot isn't empty. It's heavy, saturated with the metallic tang of cordite and the crushing weight of a narrative being rewritten in real time. When those rounds shattered the glass of Bijan's Jeep, they didn't just penetrate tissue. They pierced the thin veil of constitutional accountability. To understand why this case curdled into a decade of litigation, we have to dissect the administrative labyrinth that allowed it to happen. We need to talk about the blue no man's land, the jurisdictional friction between the U.S. Park Police, USPP, and local Fairfax County authorities. The George Washington Memorial Parkway is a scenic artery, a stretch of asphalt managed by the National Park Service. Because it's federal land, the USPP operates with a level of sovereign immunity that would make a local sheriff blush. In a standard municipal shooting, the gears of transparency, body cameras, public statements, immediate internal affairs investigations, usually grind into motion within 48 hours. But Bijan Ghaisar didn't die in a standard municipality. He was intercepted in a federal enclave. When the Fairfax County officers initially joined the pursuit, they were operating under the assumption of a collaborative effort. However, once the triggers were pulled, a cold, bureaucratic wall descended. The USPP isn't beholden to the same FOIA mandates or public oversight boards as your local precinct. They are an arm of the Department of the Interior, a sprawling leviathan where accountability often gets lost in the digestive tract of the federal judiciary. For 2 years, the FBI and the Department of Justice sat on the evidence like it was a state secret. Think about the psychological warfare of that delay. Kelly Ghaisar was forced to walk past the very spots where her son took his final breaths, knowing the dashcam footage existed, yet being told it was protected for the sake of an ongoing inquiry. This wasn't just a slow investigation. It was an intentional atmospheric cooling. The strategy is simple. Wait for the public outrage to dissipate. Wait for the headlines to cycle. Wait for the mother's voice to crack from exhaustion. They underestimated the iron in Kelly's spine. When the case finally reached a courtroom, the defense invoked the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. This is the legal equivalent of a get-out-of-jail-free card for federal agents. The argument was audacious. Because the officers were federal employees performing their duties, they were immune from state-level prosecution. It suggests that a federal badge isn't just a symbol of office, but a suit of armor that renders the wearer untouchable by the very laws they are sworn to uphold. The judges weren't just weighing the merits of a shooting. They were deciding if a federal officer has a license to kill that supersedes the sovereignty of the state of Virginia. Let's get visceral. Let's look at the trajectory of the lead. The rounds didn't just hit Bijan, they synchronized with a systemic failure of de-escalation protocols. The USPP training manual at the time was a relic of a more aggressive era, lacking the nuanced psychological training that modern urban forces had begun to adopt. There was no attempt to negotiate, no loudspeaker commands that prioritized life. There was only the pursuit, the pit maneuver, and the ultimate finality of the discharge. In the aftermath, the lack of body-worn cameras on the federal officers created an evidentiary vacuum. If it weren't for the dash cam of a local Fairfax County cruiser, a piece of equipment the park police didn't even want running, the world might never have seen the moment the light went out in that Jeep. Kelly Ghaisar's journey through the halls of the Rayburn building and the corridors of the DOJ wasn't just a quest for a guilty verdict. It was an architectural project. She was mapping the cracks in the federal monolith so no other family would fall through them. Every deposition was a brick. Every denied motion was mortar. She realized that the sanctuary isn't a physical place. It's the legislative space where a citizen's life is valued more than an agency's reputation. The Ghaisar case has forced a tectonic shift in how federal agencies interact with local law enforcement during high-stakes encounters. The Bijan Ghaisar reform isn't just a set of words on a page. It's a demand for a digital record of every interaction. It's the insistence that a federal badge does not grant a man the right to become an executioner on a dark highway. As the sun sets over the Potomac, the parkway looks tranquil, almost deceptive in its beauty. But for those who know the story, the asphalt carries a different resonance. It is a monument to the friction between state rights and federal overreach. Kelly doesn't see a scenic route. She sees a crime scene that the government tried to scrub clean with silence. She remains the sentinel at the gates of memory. Her son's name is no longer just a nomenclature of laws. It is a legal precedent, a rallying cry, and a reminder that the most potent force in the universe isn't a federal mandate. It's a mother who refuses to blink. The silence has been broken. The vacuum has been filled with her voice. And in that resonance, the truth finally finds a place to rest, even if the scales of the courthouse remain stubbornly, agonizingly on level.